Today, I'd like to use The Wizard of Oz as a case study for thinking about what happens when we conceptualize music and theater as children's literature, and conversely, what happens if we think about children's literature as music and theater, even when it doesn't obviously take these forms. The outcome that I hope to achieve is to show the participatory nature of children's literatures, literacies, and cultures. And because The Wizard of Oz is known as the American fairy tale, and the musical is often described as an American art form, I also want to think about how this participation extends to performances of childhood and national or cultural identity. As a national mythology, the American fairy tale is not sedimented in a single form, but it's rather a mythology that is possible, that can possibly transform through musical repetition. As children's literature, children's music both constructs an ideal child and enables the embodied performance of childhood by children, revealing them to be writers, performers, and composers of their musical and cultural literacies. As Alyssa Clapp-Ittmeyer has noted of 19th century British hymns for children, we can use children's music and its performances to retune the histories of childhood and children's literatures. My work on this topic is deeply rooted in my own childhood and American experience. I spent my early years growing up on a farm in rural America, and children's literature and media and films were my window on wider and other worlds. A really important event during my childhood was the annual broadcasts of The Wizard of Oz on television. These were popular between about the 1950s and the 1980s, and they were a major event in American childhood. Once a year, you would make sure that you sat down and watched this film based on L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and it was such a magical event. The brilliant Technicolor film, the kind of charming music, and the whole fantastical experience was something that you looked forward to all year long. And so this story, in case you don't know it or need a reminder, involves Dorothy, who lives on a farm in Kansas, and she feels rather misfit on the farm. And one day she's whisked away by a cyclone that picks up her house, a storm that drops her in the land of Oz, where the house kills the Wicked Witch of the East, and the Munchkins, who are the little people who live in the land of Oz, are celebrating that their freedom from her. The Good Witch of the North arrives and gives Dorothy some magic shoes. In the movie, they are ruby slippers. Dorothy wears these shoes through the course of the film, but the Wicked Witch of the West, who is the sister of the Witch of the East, who owned the shoes, wants those shoes. And so the Wicked Witch is pursuing her all along her journey, in which she travels on the yellow brick road to see the Wizard of Oz, who she hopes will be able to send her home. Along the way, she meets a scarecrow who wants a brain, a tin man who wants a heart, and a cowardly lion who wants courage. And they all hope to get their wishes granted by the wizard. When they arrive in the Emerald City where the wizard lives, he sends them into the Western country to destroy the Wicked Witch of the West. And on that condition, he will grant their wishes. They do this dutifully, but when they come back, they find out that he is just a common circus performer, a humbug. And although he's not a real wizard, he assures Dorothy's friends that they have the qualities they believe they lack. He gives them symbols of those qualities so that they can believe. And then Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, returns and tells Dorothy that she's had the power to go home all the time by clicking the heels of her ruby red slippers together 3 times. This she does, and she returns home to Kansas. So this movie was an important part of my life from a very early age. And then a little bit later, I discovered the Oz books, the original book by L. Frank Baum and its 13 sequels in my local public library. I became so obsessed with these books, I eventually discovered something called the International Wizard of Oz Club. I joined the Oz Club when I was 10, and my parents began taking me to its conventions. And I've been in the club ever since. As mentioned, I'm currently the president of the organization. But through the Oz Club and through my continued interest in Oz, I learned that there were several musical adaptations of The Wizard of Oz, including one that was first mounted on Broadway in 1903, right after the book was published in 1900. There is, of course, the famous MGM film, and as a teenager, I became enamored of the film version of The Wiz, an African-American retelling of the American fairy tale. In college, I read a book called Wicked, which tells the story of the Wizard of Oz from the Wicked Witch's point of view. And in 2003, that book was made into a musical that has become one of the most successful musicals on Broadway. It has been running for 20 years and still going strong. And so there is this strong relationship between Oz and musicals that I began to be interested in exploring. So these adaptations themselves kept bringing Oz back to me somewhat like a song that changes with each new performance. These lyrical resonances in my repeated encounters with Oz and musicals suggest to me a musicality and theatricality in the experience of children's literature. Children's literature has always been musical. Jacqueline Rose notes that lyrical forms of children's literature, such as poetry and play lore, are conventionally set in opposition or subordination to children's prose fiction with its naturalizing narrative modes. In the English language tradition, the earliest recognized children's books include Tommy Thumb's Songbook of 1744 and Thomas Carnan's Mother Goose's Melody or Sonnets for the Cradle of 1765. John Newbery's 1744 A Little Pretty Pocketbook calls itself a little songbook for teaching the alphabet. These print works demonstrate the relationship between the printed word and musicality, and between books and the oral traditions of nursery rhymes, lullabies, fairy tales, and children's songs and games. As Rose has noted, such musical forms of children's literature have been marginalized in the privileging of the written word in the Western definition of children's literature. Nonetheless, within the print tradition, the tunes to the verses might be implied. They might be part of the reader's existing repertoire. For example, you might know the tune for Ring Around the Rosie when reading Kate Greenaway's version, or the tunes may be made up in the act of reading. Children's literature has also always been theatrical. This has been explored by scholars such as Mara Gubar, Victoria Ford Smith, and Robin Bernstein. And these scholars have shown how performance can highlight the participation of children in their literature and in the performance of childhood, often with Peter Pan as a case study in response to Rose's assertion that there is a gap between the adult and the child in children's literature. The Wizard of Oz makes this theatricality explicit in the character of the wizard, as described by fairy tale scholar Maria Tatar. The wizard is a showman, not an actual wizard, or rather, he reveals that magic itself, fantasy, and literature are performances. He appears to Dorothy and her friends in the forms of a giant head and some other miraculous forms, but they learn at the end that he achieves all of this through props and ventriloquism. And the wizard in the various iterations of Oz musicals is ultimately this showman who, despite not being an actual wizard, gives the audience something to believe in. And he's able to sell that thing. Tatar describes fairy tales as being performative in this way, which is to say that through the power of words and performance, social realities can be created. Children's literature has always been material and mediated. Bernstein describes this in her theory of scripted things, in which an archive of material things provides scripts for historical performances. We can also see these in contemporary performances. And Bernstein particularly positions Newbery's Pocketbook as one origin story about children's literature in the English language, noting that it comes with the toy ball or pin cushion that children could use to go with the book. So there are oral traditions and there are material traditions in children's literature. And these are inseparable. And I think thinking about music and performance in connection with those oral and material traditions is one way to kind of bring them together and recognize that they are inseparable and that one does not necessarily precede the other. So following Bernstein's notion of scriptive things, I think of music, songs, choreography, as scriptive things that kids can perform with, and that these performances are in collaboration and kinship with adults, as suggested by Gubar and Smith, so that even if a film musical is created mainly by adults for kids' consumptions, kids are able to participate in that performance in ways that I will talk about. The experience of The Wizard of Oz through musicals, theater, and film has been closely allied with the playing out of the fairy tale and make-believe through material culture. So there are Wizard of Oz play sets, there are records and books, and you can play along to the records. And it's possible that many people would experience The Wizard of Oz, let's say the MGM film, through recordings, sheet music, and other kinds of home media, especially in the days before home video, when you had to wait a year to see the movie again. These material things and your at-home play performances were a way of re-experiencing the movie. Repetition is a basis for children's music, its pleasures, its circulations, and its lyrical disruptions of linear narratives. It provides experiences of time that are suspended, deferred, sped up, slowed down, alternately affirming and denying the usual dimensions of reality. Repetition can both sediment norms and open spaces of possibility to revise, refuse, or defy them. The intrusion of song into narrative in the musical is a disruptive act. That act is bursting into song. And this disruptive act of leaving dialogue to enter into a different mode of expression is part of what makes the musical queer and results in its camp aesthetics. These are also marks of the disruptive queerness of childhood as well. And I argue that the act of bursting into song is an act that is associated with kids, that kids and people in musicals are among those we expect to burst into song at any moment. This feature of musical theater has been explored by musical theater scholar Scott McMillan, who divides it into narrative and lyrical orders of time. So children's music foregrounds these possibilities at a generic level. Other genres of children's literature have this kind of lyricism, this kind of repetitive rather than necessarily linear structure, or maybe a repetition combined with a progressive narrative. And we find these in fairy tales and nursery rhymes especially, in the repeating elements of stories that are like the verses of a song, in the repetitive and cumulative forms of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, or the Three Little Pigs. Think of the wolf returning to each pig's house, each of the three, with his refrain, little pig, let me in. And the response, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. Or the giant's fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman every time Jack returns to the castle. Or the way Goldilocks goes almost like a song through the porridge and the chairs and the beds of the three bears, each one being, too hot, too cold, just right. Sequels and adaptations And transmedia franchises rely on these kinds of musical resonances too, acting like repeat performances of familiar songs with new differences. Thus, in the mediated and transmedia environments, story and song retain their historical relationship. And I think that that's a way that we can think about kind of the transmedia nature of these adaptations. L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz includes a lot of these kind of lyrical and repeating patterns. And there are a few places in the book where characters burst into song, but there's especially this recurring conversation that happens about brains, heart, and courage, and about home that return like a theme and variations. The structure of the story is based on rhythmically repeating and embedded cycles of 3. Dorothy has to click her heels together 3 times to go home. There are 3 parts of the journey. She meets her 3 friends in succession along the way. And so as they're going along, often the characters will talk about how they want to get the qualities they seek. Here's one example. Have you brains? I am going to the Great Oz to ask him to give me some, remarked the Scarecrow, for my head is stuffed with straw. And I am going to ask him to give me a heart, said the Woodman. And I am going to ask him to send Toto and me back to Kansas, added Dorothy. Do you think Oz could give me courage? Asked the Cowardly Lion. Just as easily as he could give me brains, said the Scarecrow, or give me a heart, said the Tin Woodman, or send me back to Kansas, said Dorothy. This kind of conversation happens several times in the book, so that there are levels of repetition within the conversation, and then because the conversation keeps happening again and again. This kind of lyrical repetition lends itself to adaptation in the musical. As in the film, each of Dorothy's friends has a song that is essentially the same song. If I only had a brain, if I only had a heart, if I only had the nerve. And again, we get the repetitions at different levels. At the end of the Cowardly Lion's version of the song, they all sing, then I'm sure to get a brain, a heart, a home, and as the Cowardly Lion calls it, the noive. So there's this lyricism that comes through in the musical adaptations as well. As is the case with many fairy tales, The Wizard of Oz has been more commonly experienced by a lot of people in dramatic and musical adaptation than in the literary version. So this musical quality is an important foundation for the American fairy tales circulation. There's very little literal representation of music in the book, but there are moments of lyricism, again, sort of breaks from the linearity of narrative. One is when Dorothy encounters the wealthy Munchkin Bock, who's hosting a celebration of the destruction of the Wicked Witch of the East, and there's music there. The Scarecrow, walking along the yellow brick road, sings to himself when he's happy, reminding us that singing while traveling is something that does not only happen in musicals. It indicates the musicality of everyday life. And there is Dorothy's silver shoes in the book. They were originally silver, which Baum describes as tinkling musically as she walks along the yellow brick road. And this presages the more explicitly musical way in which Judy Garland dances down the yellow brick road in her ruby slippers in the film. And here is where we can think about I'm going to let this play even though I don't think you'll get sound. We can think about the shoes as scriptive things. Shoes say walk or dance. Sparkly shoes maybe especially would prompt dancing, and the road leads you somewhere too. And these things, the shoes and the road, take on different kinds of significance in different versions of Wizard of Oz musicals. So in The Wiz, the Black retelling of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy moves down the yellow brick road, not to the kind of Anglo-American folk sound of Follow the Yellow Brick Road from the MGM film, but to a reworking of that tune as Ease On Down the Road, which incorporates a lot of Black musical characteristics, using bluesy melodies and syncopated rhythms and a generally funky musical texture. And in the stage show, the Yellow Brick Road is represented by these fellows in yellow tuxedos. So there's a kind of pageantry in the way Dorothy and the Wiz travels through Oz, and it becomes a metaphor for Black migration and displacement in the history of Black people in America. So because of their emphasis on theatrical and musical performance, musicals can be seen as both constructing childhood in their representations and providing an embodied space in which children can engage with these constructions. The artifice of musical theater denaturalizes and reveals performances of childhood and adulthood, empowering children and making adults childlike in the act of bursting into song. This is an inherently playful and uninhibited thing to do, and in my view, it causes musicals to be something of a youthful genre, but for participants of all ages, especially maybe in the US context, where the musical has been culturally associated with children, queer people, women, people of color, immigrants, and others on the margins. The various stage and screen adaptations of The Wizard of Oz adapt a long tradition of adults playing children on stage, often casting adolescent girls with powerful voices in the role of Dorothy and giving the character a more mature and aspirational vocality. In the process, the cultural construction of childhood is exposed as just that, a performative construction. In the 1903 version of The Wizard of Oz, which was a musical extravaganza produced during Baum's own lifetime, Dorothy was played by Anna Laughlin, who was a young adult. She was probably about 18 years old, dressed up in what a critic called baby frocks and acting and singing in a babyish voice. But this childishness was combined with a certain kind of sexuality. She wears the costume of a milkmaid, which has sexual connotations. And in this picture, you can see that she's kind of nibbling on her ribbon and returning the viewer's gaze in a suggestive way. So there's a playfulness with innocence and maturity that deconstructs the notion of childhood. Similarly, Fred Stone and David Montgomery, who played the Scarecrow and Tin Man, were described as being boyish in their performances. In MGM's The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland is also a young woman in childish drag. But in this case, she has a mature voice that gives her an augmented power and vocal agency and a real depth of feeling when she sings Over the Rainbow. Over the Rainbow is a prototypical example of what musical theater practitioners call the I Want song, which expresses the deepest desires of the main character in a musical, often a young woman. Over the Rainbow does this in childlike terms in the lyrics, but with really sophisticated music and Judy Garland's really mature singing voice. And this kind of song has its repetitions in other I Want songs, such as I'm Wishing from Snow White, which preceded it, or The Little Mermaid's Part of Your World, which also become, is another example of an I Want song that becomes a really important piece of children's culture. In The Wiz, Dorothy, in the original Broadway production, was played by Stephanie Mills, who was also a teenager, although she was small of stature, and she had a huge voice, and she belted really powerfully, singing the soulful songs that The Wiz uses to make its claim on the American fairy tale. And so there's a really empowering representation of American girlhood for Black girls and invitation to their participation in the American fairy tale in this performance. Stephanie Mills herself, as a teenager, was very aware that younger Black girls were looking up to her and her performances. She talked about it in interviews. And so there's a very deliberate kind of expansion and inclusiveness in this iteration of the musical fairy tale through musical and vocal performance. So this idea of bursting into song that I associate so much with childhood and with musicals is something that I see young people doing when they take the Wizard of Oz into their own hands for their own purposes. Breaking into song not only is the core convention of musical theater, but it also allows us to see the figure of the child bursting into song in a way that appears natural and irrepressibly musical, but might also be an intentional and even strategic act. Actual children might know that they're performing a version of childhood, often in opposition to adulthood. Just to kind of point to some evidence of a historical belief about kids and their irrepressible musicality, I turned to Newberry's Little Pretty Pocketbook again, which admonishes children to control their urge to sing, hum, or whistle in public, or while walking along the street, or in the presence of adults. More recently, and in a more celebratory vein, the composer and folklorist Ruth Crawford Seeger, in her introduction to American Folk Songs for Children, recounted parents' observations about their children bursting into song during their play and daily activities at home. So for adults who wanted to learn these children's folk songs, Seeger even advised, carry the song around with you as children do. You will probably find yourself breaking out with it at odd moments as children do. So there is this notion that children carry songs with them and break out into them at certain moments. And I refer to this as carrying tunes. It means that you have a song in your head that you can burst into at any moment. And then from The Wizard of Oz, just in this example, you have songs and dances and objects and costumes associated with the film or whatever version of a Wizard of Oz musical you're familiar with that can script those performances and prompt that bursting into song. This act of bursting into song, for me, is material evidence that children have voices. Scholars fret over whether and how kids' voices are authentic or not, or even possible or not, but kids just keep bursting into forms of vocality that are specific to their unique bodies. And so the voice is not only a metaphor for children's agency, but it's also a material performed practice. And as Elisa Clappett-Meyer notes, kids can assert their agency in song by interpreting, singing with expression, singing in different tempos and dynamics, and rebelling internally against the lyrics. Refusing to sing along as having a voice too, defying a concept of childhood, privileging some form of expression over others. And so there is these are scripts, songs are scripts, and singing is a script that can either be resisted or followed or revised. During a brief ethnographic exercise I conducted with some grade school students putting on a production of Beauty and the Beast at their school, I observed a lot of kids constantly bursting into song. They would sing songs from other musicals in their spare time and with each other. This formed a kind of communal repertoire that gave them an identity as theater kids. And occasionally they would sing their thoughts and their conversations. I heard one student singing about how he had a test the next day. So there's a formation of community around the act of bursting into song. And this act of bursting into song can be a consciously youthful statement. An 11-year-old described for me how she sang Defying Gravity from Wicked, another Oz musical, and she was singing it over and over again, trying to hit the highest note. And her parents complained about it, but she said, "Too bad," and she just kept singing along to the recording. And I often encounter this kind of act of kind of like singing to the annoyance of parents as a sort of way of asserting some opposition to parental control. So the acts of bursting into song are made possible by the scripts. And at home, these performances are ways of recreating the American fairy tale in such ways that you and your friends and your siblings and whoever you're playing with are included. So especially, again, in the 20th century, when you could only see the movie once a year, playing Oz was a common activity in the United States. I was on a wooded path in a park one summer with some other kids, and somebody just started singing "We're Off to See the Wizard" from The Wizard of Oz. And we didn't talk about what we were going to do. We all just started doing the choreography. We linked arms and started skipping down the path and singing the song together. So that scripting of the American fairy tale is something that comes right up out of the memory. And then if you see school productions of The Wizard of Oz or The Wiz or any other Oz musical, what you will see is kids making those roles their own. And this is kind of a variation on the play at home. And you see lots of different kinds of girls playing Dorothy in lots of different ways. You see a lot of non-traditional casting, in which Dorothy may be played by girls of different races or ethnicities or with a disability. The Cowardly Lion is a character that is often good for young people to explore ideas about gender and sexual identity under the kind of cover of theater and performance. And these performances also take on kind of local flavors depending on where they're being performed. Sometimes they're more playful, sometimes they're more formal. Audiences have a lot of respect, and parents have a lot of respect for The Wizard of Oz as an important American story. And so these performances are considered to be important, but it's also really important to make them fun and playful. So the use of props is something that is a strong motivation for playing Oz. Even if you're playing at home, any pair of red shoes will do for the ruby slippers. You can put a funnel on your head for the Tin Man's hat, and that may right away prompt you to break into If I Only Had a Heart. A broomstick, any broom will serve as the Wicked Witch's broomstick. And especially in informal situations, it's not uncommon for boys to play Dorothy. And so anybody can act out this idea of being the hero or heroine of the American fairy tale. All of this takes place across different media, cultures, and so I think that it's useful to think about the dynamics of musicality and theatricality when thinking about transmedia adaptation. And my hope is that by attending to these issues of song and music and theater and performance, we can add to the conversation about what the transmedia cultures for children are and how long they've been around. So Oz as a national fairy tale, as a national myth, circulates through these musicals, not necessarily in a progressive way and not necessarily in the sense of being handed down from adults to children, but I like to think of them in queer fashion, and as suggested by children's literature scholar Derek Mason, that there's the possibility of thinking of children's literature spreading and circulating, not in a strictly reproductive way, but in a way that can be transformative and can challenge norms and change the landscape of the American fairy tale and who belongs in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. thank you for this fantastic talk. I'm sure that there will be lots of questions. Ella, do you want to read the question?
Okay. Hello, in which version you find Dorothy the most interesting and complex as a character? Thank you for the splendid lecture. It's from Marta.
Thank you, Marta. That's an interesting question. I think the two, oh my gosh, well, there are three that are just fascinating to me, and they're the three that I talked about. In one sense, the earliest one, the Anna Laughlin one from the 1903 show, is kind of the most intriguing in some ways because we don't have that performance anymore. I have to try to reconstruct it in my mind from reviews and pictures and what I know about her biography, which isn't very much. And that whole show is such a kind of strange to our eyes from the present moment. It's just a strange carnivalesque production that has all of these ethnic stereotypes that were kind of popular performances in turn of the century America, and a lot of this kind of play with identity of gender and sexuality. There are a lot of cross-dressing roles in it. Well, there's one. And so it really kind of represents the diversity of America at its time, but using the stereotypes that some of which are inherited from minstrelsy and similar types of theater. So I think I find that kind of the most intriguing. But Judy Garland's performance is also just very kind of subtle and complex in certain ways because of the way she's consciously playing this kind of earnest girlhood. And then Stephanie Mills is just such a powerful singer in The Wiz. So I love them all, but maybe there's a little bit of mystery in that first one that I find especially kind of fascinating.
Thank you. I think that we have two more questions. Christine Case, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Christine, and Ryan, I'm actually a previous advisee of Dr. Bickford's as well. And
that's why your name is familiar. Yes.
Yes, sir. We've been meaning to email.
Yes.
But I will say that, so a low-hanging fruit question is I want to hear more about the Oz fan club and the conventions and how that's informed you and fan community and fanfic and just all of that. But my other question has to do with bursting into song. And you mentioned these broadcasts that were annually, but like maybe also not entirely predictable. And I studied the Mary Martin one. I studied most of them, but I particularly enjoyed the Mary Martin Peter Pan. And I was thinking about the song I've Got a Crow, which similarly exhibits this, like, I must do this exuberance. And of course, Peter Pan is the everlasting child, but in this edition played by the grown woman ever since its infancy, the Mary Martin Peter Pan, the Robin, that Peter Pan has been played by an adult woman until actually the touring production but the touring production today changes that. But so I was wondering your thoughts on this idea of like, I've got to crow both child, animal, and adult, right? Because you have it from the child perspective, it's linking it to animal, but it's actually being sung by the adult representation of childhood, not entirely unlike what you're talking about with Judy Garland. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that and its relation to your work. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great connection. And I have also been thinking about Peter Pan just as another, instance of like, one of these kind of representations of childhood in musicals that you're right, it's the adult, the child, and the animal. If you go back to, Peter Pan's origins, the character first appears in Barrie's The Little White Bird, and he's described as a bird, which is why he can fly. He's a bird who never grew into a child. My kind of broader research on children's music, I encounter a lot of references to birds, right? There are a lot of analogies of kids to birds. And then here in this kind of variation on that, you've got, I've Got a Crow, which is, it's not the nice songbird, but it's more this exuberant kind of like, cocky Peter Pan thing. And I absolutely see that as also expressing this kind of like irrepressible like musicality and energy of the eternal child. You know, the Mary Martin's embodiment of that kind of emphasizes the performativity of it, and makes it sort of a conscious, I think, performance of those categories. Yeah, so I think it's an interesting variation on kind of like the child as songbird, the child as crow. And in terms of fandom, the International Wizard of Oz Club is obviously has been an important influence on my life and work. And that's also a place where there's a lot of musical and theatrical performance. We like to put on shows at our conventions. I played the piano for them for a long time. I've been in them, I've sung in them, I've acted in them. One of the first things I did at the first conventions I went to is I got involved in some puppet shows. And then I became a puppeteer for a while. So this sort of element of performance is really strong in the Oz fandom. And there are a lot of people in the Oz Club who are theater professionals and enthusiasts. And there's a huge overlap in that community between Oz fandom and musical theater fandom. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I can have another question when we come back around, but thank you for
Okay.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions.
Yes, in the chat.
The chat?
Yeah.
Ella, go ahead.
Okay, so first from Milena. I would like to ask what you think about the colors in the new upcoming movie version of Wicked. For technical reasons, the Wizard of Oz had very saturated colors, but the new films from this world seem so faded, which in my opinion deprives the world of its unique character. Thank you.
Thank you. We've gotten just little teases of the visuals for the Wicked film, and I think it looks really beautiful. But I agree that it doesn't have the same kind of like really saturated color that the 1939 film does. I do think that quality of the film was part of what appealed to me as a child, although you couldn't see it as well on TV in the 1980s as you can see it in restored films on screen now. But still, I've also described MGM's Wizard of Oz as kind of a live action animated feature because it was trying to duplicate the success of Snow White and do something a little bit like what Disney was having success with. So I think that kind of saturated Technicolor environment was it was very specific to sort of the time and moment of the film. And so I guess I treasure that, and then we'll see what kind of magic they do with this film. And Wicked is a different kind of story and property too. It's more dystopian, and so maybe that's appropriate. The stage production has this kind of industrial design to it. So I'm really looking forward to the movie, but I know very little about it. They're keeping it really under wraps. And so I'm on pins and needles to see what's in it.
Thank you. Everyone is looking forward. With Ariana Grande, I think that will be a big movie. So yeah. There are three more questions. Ayman Khan, please go ahead. Your hand is raised.
Hello, my name is Ayman Khan. I am a postgraduate student in Aligarh Muslim University, India. And my question is that with time, each classical work acquires meaning that is quite different. So how does the Wizard of Oz stand today in the times of the Fourth Industrial Revolution? And I also have another question, which is that whenever we take up an adaptation of a theatrical adaptation, every adaptation has a different dialect, or according to the audience they are portraying it to, or the time it is being portrayed in. So how are such theatrical performances decided? And that is it. Thank you.
Well, musicals and film, stage and film musicals are multi-authored. And so one of the things that I try to think about is how many different people and how many voices and how many different motivations there are in the adaptation of a new version. And so it's a little bit of kind of a mess sometimes how these things come about. The MGM film went through many screenwriters and lots of different changes of concept. And so I think also in any individual version, there are competing ideas, competing politics. So there were some people who were working on the MGM film who had more kind of conservative traditional values and were very into the idea of home is best. There were also a lot of queer people and immigrants and Jewish people working on the film who might have had a more critical posture to that. And I think that's where the camp quality of the film comes from, in part, is kind of like sending up of fantasy and of the conservative moral at the same time as showing some affection for it. The Wiz is very much of its time, taking place in sort of the late civil rights movement. And Wicked is very influenced by the kinds of girl stories that have become popular in the 21st century about, you know, being a witch as a metaphor for feminine empowerment, and also about kind of the feeling of that we're living in a dystopia. And it really does a great job of addressing both of addressing political concerns from kind of a young woman's perspective. So, and that was very intentional on the part of the writers. So I think that there are a lot of voices in any single version that do always speak to the times and often to what the experiences of young people are in those times too.
Thank you so much, Brian, for this experience. We have more questions, which is exciting.
Yes.
Maybe the one from the chat, Ella?
Yes, because Tomasz here writes, I want to also complement the presentation. As I know, there is one book, Journey of the Author by Fogler, where he describes some hierarchy of creating the story. Do you know this book? If so, do you think that this book could be helpful with describing Oz universe of books, musical, movies? What about, in general, American fairy tales?
What a great question. I am familiar with this book. It's kind of a handbook to screenwriting. And you know, it's the Hollywood formula that's inspired by like Joseph Campbell's, you know, Hero with 1,000 Faces. And it uses The Wizard of Oz as its primary example. And so I love that you bring that up because it is, I think, an example of how The Wizard of Oz is used to kind of like illustrate any concept and to become the standard of storytelling in Hollywood. And so I think it's actually a really important sort of aspect of The Wizard of Oz influence on our culture, because it does sort of set up this formula, and it's based on the film, not the book, which has some extra elements in it. And I think that we might more often look to those kinds of sources, like the sources that practitioners, filmmakers use in conceptualizing their stories, because I mean that's the pattern that's followed by a lot of American films, and in that sense they can be seen as extensions of the American fairy tale, as American mythology that The Wizard of Oz kind of exemplifies, even structurally. Thank you for that. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, great question. We have 3 more questions. Christine, Michael, and Jolly. Christine, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. We've been talking about heightened performativity, of course, throughout many of these performances. In a nutshell, Wicked itself is about heightened performativity of goodness, wickedness, etc. I'm really interested in the disability arc. In Maguire's book, he compares the greenness of Elphaba to a curse, a blight, a disability, and a race. And of course, we have some Broadway issues with thinking about casting actual wheelchair users as Nessarose, but then when she has to become walkable with the shoes, like I'm not sure how that's going to work. So really briefly, you mentioned in your ethnography disability factors in reenactments of The Wizard of Oz, and I was wondering if you could touch on that for a minute.
Yeah, thank you. So in particular, what I'm thinking of there is kind of, you may have, I've seen articles about production with, Dorothy was played by a girl in a wheelchair, her service dog was Toto. And it becomes this kind of like news story. And so one of the things about kind of the Oz mythology is that it has all of these characters with different embodiments. The Scarecrow, the Tin Man, nobody has this kind of normate body really, except for Dorothy. And so there's a lot in the Oz books and in these musicals about what it is to be human, like this quest for brains, heart, and courage. That's kind of a disability metaphor too. And who counts as human in the American fairy tale is something that I try to think about when I'm looking at these different versions. And we can think of childhood and youth in terms of disability too. Like, what are the ways in which the environment and society discriminates against young people and their abilities? So all of that kind of intersects for me, and it does come together with kind of the ideas about race and then monstrosity, the idea of of difference as a disability, as a superpower, and all of those things are kind of interplaying, and they are, because it's theater, it's both, it can be inclusive, but it can also be a spectacle. So yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is that some idea of disability is intersecting with all of these other, identity issues and issues of representation, and even bursting into song. When Elphaba does it, it's both a superpower and a kind of thing that makes her the amount of power she has an element of monstrosity to it that makes her the Wicked Witch. So yeah, that's all a lot to think about.
Yeah. That was a great question. Okay, Michael, it's your turn. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I want two questions actually. The first one, will there be a sequel to your book, Ryan?
Oh, I don't think there will. My next book is about children's music in the 20th century in the United States, and so that book will be about things like Peter Pan and It's a Small World, The Ballad of Davy Crockett, and kind of the canon of classic children's songs.
Anjali, go ahead.
Right, am I audible?
Yes, it's good to hear you. Hello.
Lovely to see you, Timothy. Although I must please pardon my inability to turn on my camera because I'm traveling right now. But I'll just jump to my question. Thank you for a lovely presentation, Ryan. The phrase that goes by Friends of Dorothy, right, to refer to queer people. So that finds its root in this particular, in The Wizard of Oz. And often that's connected to the fact that Judy Garland was a gay icon, but also there are several euphemisms and innuendos, be it when Dorothy is asked by, I believe, a traveling companion, she's asked, "You have some queer friends, Dorothy," and she replies, "The queerness doesn't matter, so as long as they're friends." And there are all these little bits wherein even, I believe, bisexuality is also referred to when the Scarecrow is asked which road to take. And he says that, well, some people take both. So, but the intentionality of including these from Baum's side is often questioned. So do you, as a scholar who's like researched a lot in this particular aspect, do you think that Baum intended to put in these euphemisms and innuendos, or are we just reading way too much into it? Thank you.
Thank you. Baum was, so there's a lot of androgyny and fluidity of gender in the Oz books. And there are a couple of layers here because there's some of those quotes are from the books and some of them are from the movie. Baum's mother-in-law was a well-known suffragist, Matilda Gage, and he was very much, I think we could say, a feminist. And it's often noted that his work is very kind of progressive about gender and its fluidity. Among other things, we have the aforementioned Ozma, who is transformed into a boy and then back into a girl. And for a lot of transgender fans of Oz, that's an important kind of point of identification and celebration of the Oz books. So I mean, Baum, I think the Oz books are very queer. You know, Baum's using a language there that I think we can really think in terms of queerness as going against the normative. And then in the movie, you have all of these kind of quippy lines. And I don't know that, you know, people do go both ways is necessarily intended the way we hear it. Or there's the part where Glenda, you know, sings, come out wherever you are to the Munchkins when she's having them come out of hiding. But I do think that the general kind of camp aesthetic of the film is something that we can think of as possibly not entirely accidental. There were a lot of queer people working on the film, especially in kind of like the set design departments. The unit that began working together on The Wizard of Oz later became known as Freed's Fairies in making Arthur Freed being the producer. Because there were a lot of queer people involved. And so I think that there might be some drawing on queer aesthetics as known to people in Hollywood in the 1930s. So it's there, it's subtle. And then, you know, we also have this ability to kind of like pick up on some codes that are there and then add some things of our own.
Right. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have more questions. Shams, please go ahead.
Yeah, Jayesh, Matthews, Elizabeth. Okay, good evening. Okay, I'm learning Polish, by the way.
It's lovely to see you.
Hi, Ryan, that was such a nice lecture from your side. I really enjoyed it, but I had some work, so I had to very unfortunately leave it in between. And I did have a question when I initially heard you, and just a moment, and I wrote it. So the question is very straight and simple. Like, you see, considering the enduring popularity of songs like Over the Rainbow, how has the music of The Wizard of Oz transcended its original context to become iconic in its own time? And, you know, you see, it has also influenced posterity to cherish. So would you like to comment on that? I'm so sorry if you have covered it in your lecture. I'm so sorry.
No, that's great. In the particular case of Over the Rainbow, first it benefited from being the kind of song that becomes a standard. It was recorded by jazz musicians and pop vocalists. It became part of Judy Garland's permanent repertoire too. I was very closely associated with her, and she would sing it in her concerts in the 50s and 60s. And, you know, it eventually became declared the song of the 20th century. And it's been recorded so many times. So that it does travel to a lot of different contexts. One of the one of the places where Over the Rainbow has found a home is as an anthem of the queer community. And the LGBTQ choruses use it all the time in their repertoire. And sometimes when it's sung at events, people wave their rainbow flags. The rainbow flag is not inspired by The Wizard of Oz, but that connection gets made anyway by people. So Judy Garland being a gay icon, that's one way in which Over the Rainbow takes on some different kinds of meanings, and there it becomes part of the queer mythology of Oz, where you may be, especially as a young person growing up in the place where you are, being kind of isolated, and then you know, going to the Emerald City is a metaphor for leaving the farm and going to New York or San Francisco and finding your people. And it's that idea of Over the Rainbow, of a utopian future. It takes on that specific meaning in that context. People use it as a lullaby. They sing it, you know, to their kids at night. And it becomes this kind of statement about environmentalism and indigeneity in the performance by Israel Kamakawiwo'ole. I think that the song is really adaptable because of kind of the simplicity of its lyrics.
I see. Thank you very much. Congratulations to the organizers and the Virginia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for learning Polish, at least some lovely words. That's always so nice to hear. Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for your fantastic answer. I think that there's one more question. Am I right, Ella?
Yes, I think it's time for the last question.
Yes.
Okay. So from Bartłomiej, who says, hello, thanks so much for the great lecture. I have a question regarding the contemporary status of the musical. As The Wizard of Oz is one of the most iconic musicals, I reckon it must be a fond memory for people with various worldviews, especially in America. Does the American far right nowadays try to somehow reinterpret the story so that they can pretend it doesn't have the great importance that it has for queer people? I hope my train of thought makes sense.
It does make sense. And I don't know of any significant instances of that. There have been times in the past when The Wizard of Oz has been kind of part of the reaction against fantasy in general, you know, as irreligious or satanic or something. But I don't know, maybe The Wizard of Oz is just so kind of sacred that it doesn't get attacked that way, or maybe it's because it's so flexible, because it's so you know, transferable. It's a story that can be interpreted in any way. And so I think what would be more likely is that there would be people who think it's a shame that the LGBTQ community has appropriated The Wizard of Oz from its supposedly wholesome American sources for perverse purposes. But it's a really good question, and I think that it's been Wizard of Oz has gone through its ups and downs in its reputation, but it's pretty secure now.
Thank you, Ryan, for your answer, and thank you for this fantastic talk. Really, I'm impressed as always. I've known you for many years, and I've always been impressed with your work. You know that I'm a big fan of your work. So thank you for. Yeah, thank you for agreeing to give this talk. We've all really loved it, and we're looking forward to seeing you again, maybe in Wrocław. You're always welcome. So
why, thank you.
One day, maybe you will come here and give a talk in person. And talking about talks, yes, and talking about talks, next month we'll have another talk in the series. Am I right, Ella?
Yes, you're right. And I think that our speaker is here with us.
Yeah, Sarah, yes. So soon we will share the poster. Sarah Park-Dalen will talk about Asian American children's literature. So we hope to see you all here next month. So Ryan, thank you again. Ella, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone
Yes.
for attending and asking questions.
Yes, asking all the comments. Thank you, Ryan. Thank everybody. See you soon.
You're welcome.
It's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure for us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.